Okay, I'm Tim Smith, as has been said, and I'm Regional Director for JRS in Southern Africa, which means that we look after refugees in Angola, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, either in camp settings or sometimes in urban settings. We're also keeping an eye on the developing situation in Mozambique, which is quite worrying, in the north of Mozambique, but we actually don't have a presence there. So I'll hand over to Sally for her introduction.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. And thanks to Mike and CPLO for bringing this, or hosting us and bringing this training together. So I'm Sally Gandar, as Mike mentioned, and I'm Head of Advocacy and Legal Advisor at the Scalabrini Centre of Cape Town. By training, I'm an attorney, but I work mainly on advocacy at Scalabrini. So we assist refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in South Africa, both through individual one-on-one assistance. We have a number of programs that we run that assist, whether it's through welfare or learning English or trying to get access to employment. But then we also do
sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Just the usual request from the interpreter that you go a little bit more slowly.
Slower.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But
Thanks
also
for the reminder.
Good idea if kind of at the end of each sentence you just take a conscious pause and then it allows time for catch up.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So yeah, so we do litigation, and then we also interact quite extensively with Parliament, and as well as other advocacy and refugee and asylum seeker assistance organizations here in South Africa and regionally. So Tim and I, we're very excited today to speak more on the advocacy needs of migrants. And so I'm just going to give a brief outline of how we've divided up our presentation. You'll get some slides from me and then some from Tim, and we'll probably, well, we are going to be tag teaming. So first of all, just a general housekeeping. We'd really like this presentation to be as interactive as possible. I know that that's slightly more difficult when one is interacting in a virtual setting. But if you have comments, if you have questions, please can you use the raise hand function, which you should be able to see. It's either at the bottom of the list of participants on your screen, or it should be at the bottom of your screen and it says raise hand. And then we're also going to be asking for everyone who is here to please share their experiences with us, because much of our presentation relies on the input that everyone in this virtual room has and is able to provide. And so we're here to learn and to try and share resources together with everyone who's here. I'm just quickly checking my notes. There we go. Okay. So very briefly, we're going to go through what the needs of migrants and asylum seekers are first. So this is different from the advocacy needs, but just looking at what needs there are out there and how one can and does, or people do respond to them. Then we're looking at the response. So how do we advocate for these needs? And what are the challenges? Are there challenges faced by persons who are not refugees and asylum seekers, but who are advocating for the needs of these groups? And what are the challenges that refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants might face when advocating for their own needs. We also want to have a look at and just address, how the demands are, or the sometimes requests are received. So who are the audiences that we're looking to request or ask for these needs or target when we do advocacy for refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants? Finally, it wouldn't be an advocacy topic unless we did address something that's very present in South Africa, but also elsewhere. And that's the topic of xenophobia and afrophobia, and how that links into advocacy and advocacy needs. And then we've got a very quick note on creative advocacy, sometimes also known as artistic activism, just to use it as a comparison to other types of advocacy, the more formal advocacy that we will be discussing. Tim, if I can hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sally. And thanks everyone for participating today. So at the beginning, we just wanted to look at what the needs are that refugees and migrants have. And then from that, we'll build up a picture of how we can do advocacy. So here I would just like to try to invite you to share with us what your experience is. What in your experience are the biggest needs that people who flee from their countries or who move from their countries to your country or to your region, what are their greatest needs? What's normally the first need that they have when they come? And perhaps people can just respond, either switch on their microphone and respond, or raise a hand and we will identify them.
I see that Mark from Nigeria has raised his hand.
Mark?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you and for this very wonderful introduction and for making it participatory. I know food is really, really very, very important. Food is a very important need that even to a large extent, if there is no shelter, you could still need to want to have something to eat first before you seek for shelter. So, but food and shelter will go hand in hand. These two, I think, are the first very
good. Thank you, Mark. That's a very important need, though, the physical needs that people have. Berhanu, you have a hand up too?
Yes, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Sally. I think the refugees and the migrants, first of all, they move out because they are insecure in their own countries. So therefore, the first thing that they look for is security.
Right, safety and security.
That's right.
Good. I think that was the one of the first that we put on our list, safety and protection. And in our experience, that's at the top of their minds. Okay, thank you.
The interpreter is asking again if people would remember to speak slowly, please.
Thank you. Okay, so we've had safety and protection, and we've had food and shelter. Any other needs that you would...
Philip Kimber, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for this topic. In my experience staying with refugees, the first thing they wanted was someone who was able to listen to their story, someone who could understand their situation before I came to assist them, but just to listen, because some have been through traumatic experiences. Some have lost their jobs, some have lost their families. they have lost their place of abode. It's a new place. So they want someone whom they can confide to. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Very important. So some kind of a listening ear, some kind of reception, some kind of ability to hear what's been happening to them. Very important need. And that goes along with the need for safety and protection. Anybody else?
Maybe we can give some hints.
Yes, okay.
So there's one on the screen. I'm gonna go for another one.
All right. So we've put two on the screen. One is a need for medical help, and we have seen that very often in dealing, especially with refugees. We needed in Angola in 2017 to give a lot of medical care to people because they had come across the border very traumatized and sometimes injured. Then the need to be heard and to be received, reception. And then we talked about, and we haven't had anybody mention it yet, but the need for some kind of documentation. That we'll discuss later on who supplies these different needs. And then we've talked about physical needs. Some people mentioned food and others have mentioned shelter. Are there any other needs that people can identify? Philip?
Thank you again. You know, when someone comes to a new place, like our refugees, they are new in the area. So they want to know also if there is someone from their place to identify themselves with a person from their place whom they can start relating with, because they are in a foreign land, in a foreign place where there are new people. The moment they discover each other, it's easier. They can now talk about their situation. Because what refugees go through is that sometimes we listen, but if they speak to themselves, they understand each other and they can help each other even to heal faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. So a need for community and a need to share their own culture with people from their own country. We put that down as cultural and community needs.
Yes.
What about going forward? If people are having to stay in a foreign place for a while, what would be other needs that they would have?
Dumisani at Imbisa wants to make a point.
Yes. I wanted to say some people are interested in knowing what's happening back home, you know, information, news about home, you know, that knows because they left without preparation. So there's always a need to know how are they back where I come from. I think that's important.
Thank you. We didn't list that one, but it's a good one. Yes, information about home and about other members of the family who have been left behind. Thank you. What about more long-term needs? If you have to stay in a place for a long time and you have children and you want to make a living, then there would be needs for education and also eventually for livelihood to be able to sustain yourself. So we put those down on our list as well, education and livelihoods as well. Okay, so we have a list of 7 or 8 of the important needs to which we need to add the one of information. Is there another one that we've left out perhaps that you in your experience have come across?
I think also refugees, besides being a refugee, someone wants to be working. If somebody gets something to do to earn a living, one is more, proud to be or to express himself or herself because you get what you want because you are working for it. Besides getting food handouts, having children, fees being paid, but if one is working, I think that's where you discover in refugee camps, people normally live privately and go to work in the nearby villages or even further away and come back over weekends. This is my experience with them. You don't normally find all of them around, but during the course of the day, they go out to do some work in the fields, somewhere else, and they come back at home. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. So you could add to our list there employment or self-employment, because many refugees end up being self-employed. And those things are very important for self-worth and for dignity. So I think we have a few that we need to add to our list there. Self-employment and employment and information as well. Okay, I think that's quite a comprehensive list. I'm going to hand over now back to Sally, and she'll talk about how we can advocate for these needs.
Thank you, Tim. So that last point, I think, is really important because it speaks to something that Tim has mentioned, which is dignity. And dignity is interwoven with the need for meaning. And I think that there are very many different ways that individuals can find meaning, but being able to be a productive member of society and community has been one of the ways that the South African courts have spoken about the right to work for refugees and asylum seekers. I think that there are many other contexts where we can speak about the need for meaning, whether it's coming together in a religious community or other forms of community as well. Zachary, you've raised your hand. Please go ahead. Zach?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that as part of what the needs we have just mentioned, the safety, protection, medical, and all those that we have mentioned, I think they should also have a right to all these. Because you might have all these needs listed, but if they don't have a right to it, then it is a problem.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think you guys must have learnt all about the various rights that are available through different laws internationally, etc., in the presentation yesterday. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yes, okay, great. So now I'd like to pose a question, and please, those of you who haven't spoken and those of you who have, please provide us with some examples from your own experience. And that is, we have a short list of needs that you can see on your screen here, and you've given us more that we should be adding to this list. But how does one advocate for those needs? What are the different strategies that can be used to advocate for those needs? Can anyone volunteer some examples or strategies that you've used in your context? So maybe I can give an example from the work that I do. So one of the strategies that we've used is letter writing. So sometimes there an issue. And let's use a very recent example. I think that many, if not everyone, in this session has had to live through some form of a government-imposed lockdown as a result of the coronavirus. And we saw here in South Africa that one of the impacts of that lockdown was that services were not provided at the various refugee reception offices where asylum seekers and refugees have to go from time to time to renew the documentation that allows them to be in South Africa legally. And when one's documentation expires, the result is other barriers that you face. Sometimes your bank account is frozen. Sometimes your employer is worried about allowing you to come to work because they might be employing someone who doesn't have the valid documentation to work anymore. And so we used a strategy, which was to write to the Minister of Home Affairs and to advocate for a blanket extension on all asylum documentation. And that served two purposes. One was to ensure that that people's documentation was extended, and the other was to ensure that it was done in a way that meant that people wouldn't have to travel to faraway offices of the Department of Home Affairs in order to get that renewal, because that travel would be against the lockdown, and it would also place them at risk of exposure to the coronavirus. So that's one example of a type of way that one can advocate for needs. And in that example, we were advocating for the documentation needs of asylum seekers and refugees. But then that documentation provides a door to other types of needs that someone can access. Can anyone else add further examples to the one that I've just provided? I think
maybe if
Berhanu,
we
yes.
took them in list as somebody's.
Berhanu?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I think, first of all these needs are, we can't pretend that these needs are fulfilled by civil society or any actor, but by the government, state actors. So I think it is important to create awareness that the government has to take care of the refugees or asylum seekers. Now, I could give one example that in recent months, the refugees from Syria flooded in the streets of Addis. And they come through Sudan and then they enter into the country. And rather than going to the refugee center or any center, but they kept on seeking for daily upkeeping in the streets. So civil societies and even the population have reacted negatively that what the government is doing in this case, that the refugees from Syria are flooding begging in the streets. So it went on the media and people reacted. So the government took immediate action and put them in the centers and provided what they needed. And after a week or so, they were not in the streets. So I think raising the voice for the voiceless is also very important in different aspects.
Absolutely, and that's a very interesting example, especially for me coming from South Africa, where we don't have a camp-based system in South Africa, and so there are different entities that are responsible or not for different needs. So thank you for that example. That's very useful. Does anyone else have more examples to add to mine and Berhanu's? Perhaps I can pose another question, which is simply what is our understanding of advocacy? So what does advocacy mean? I see that Berhanu's hand is still up, and I think that's from before, but Mark, you have raised your hand. Go ahead. Yes, Mark.
Mark is muted.
In just a few words, advocacy could simply be referred to or defined as a process of mediation. It is also a process that leads to intervention on behalf of perhaps people that are highly vulnerable and less privileged in terms of processes for intervention to a group or an individual that is trying to advocate on behalf of this category of people. This, to my understanding, is a simple meaning of what advocacy could be referred to.
Thank you. That's a great summary, and I really like that. So what you're saying is there is a group, and that group may be vulnerable, and so the role of advocacy is to amplify the needs and perhaps the vulnerabilities of that group in order to achieve an intervention.
Sure.
Now, can we think of maybe, so that's a broad definition and a very good one, but are there ways of thinking of perhaps different levels of advocacy? So, for example, if we think about the needs that Tim went through with everyone, and one of those needs that one of the examples that was provided was that sometimes people need to speak about their experiences, and sometimes this takes the form of needing trauma counseling. Another one is perhaps needing to find community and to find people who maybe are from your country of origin, but to be able to join together. And so what Tim and I looked at there was that we need to understand pastoral care as a form of advocacy. If I can go back to the organization that I work for, which is Scalabrini Center, the very beginning of Scalabrini in Cape Town was the administering of pastoral care to the refugee community here in Cape Town. And so this is one level of advocacy. The next level that we have is the trauma counseling, which I've mentioned. And then we've got direct personal care. And so that's trying to assist people with those basic needs of food, housing, etc. one of the other types of advocacy that we get is provision of advice at a grassroots or very direct one-on-one level. And I'll use an example again from my work experience, which is we have a walk-in paralegal advice service so that people can come and understand more about what their rights are and what their entitlements are in the South African context. So grassroots advice provision is a further form of how one can advocate for needs. Then we have accompaniment. Does anyone want to volunteer a guess or an opinion about what accompaniment might be? No guesses there. Okay. Tim, I wonder if you can provide an example here. I remember that we spoke of one which was based on your experience in Angola, I believe.
I was just thinking it's very closely allied to what we were talking about before, the ability to listen and the need people have to be listened to. So one of the important things that we were able to do in Angola, and that's where the picture on the right comes from, was to spend time with those refugees who had come from Congo and were very traumatized, and to spend time listening to them and hearing their stories, many of which were terrible stories. They had lost family members. They had seen houses burnt and crops destroyed. So that was a very important factor. And of course, that can lead to other forms of advocacy, finding family relatives or getting documentation and so on. So for us, it was a very important element. But I'm sure many other people listening will have had that experience as well.
I see that. Thank you so much, Tim. Onoman, you've got your hand raised?
Yes, good morning, Sally.
Hi. Please share with us.
I'll be speaking from the context of the Cameroonian refugees in Cross River State, southern part of Nigeria. In terms of accompaniment, due to their vulnerabilities with regards to gender-based violence, we actually assisted them in getting legal services, accompanied them to get justice, access to justice in courts, to have redress. Because we noticed even within the camps, we had some hoodlums who were still abusing them, infringing on their fundamental rights. So Caritas has assisted some of these survivors in getting access to justice. Why? Hello.
Thank you. Can you still hear
us?
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please carry on.
Okay, and also even the children who came into Nigeria, we also assisted them in getting registered birth certificates, registration with the National Population Commission, so they could be registered and accorded nationality status while in the camp also. So those are some of the accompaniments we've had for the refugees in southern Nigeria and Cross River State precisely. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I think those are incredibly powerful examples, especially when one considers the long-term positive impacts. For example, the reduction of something like statelessness as a result of accompanying people in order to get birth registration documentation. And it also speaks to the way that as someone in the advocacy space, we can use our own power and privilege. Perhaps it's a privilege related to the fact that we have our documentation and we are citizens, or perhaps it's power and privilege related to where we work and how that can help to highlight specific issues and needs and ensure an accurate intervention, as Mark had mentioned earlier. Mark, I see your microphone is on. Do you want to add anything more?
No, not for now. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So then the next one that I have here, and it's the first example that I used, was letter writing. And this is, for me, it's formal letter writing to persons in position of power who are able to effect change. Usually, this type of letter writing would be to the government. Perhaps sometimes it would also include writing to an international organization like the UNHCR, but it would depend on your country context. And then as a lawyer, I have to mention this one, which is the use of legal advocacy. And so that is perhaps when those other types of advocacy that are listed above, when they haven't been successful or the intervention has not made the impact that is needed. And so a systemic barrier is identified. Then an option is to use the courts and the judiciary in order to effect much broader change. An example here is what we found, and I'm going to use examples from my context, but I hope that others will bring examples from your own work experience as participants have already. But I apologize for the South Africa focus of my examples. But one of the examples for legal advocacy that we have is the use of litigation in order to secure the right to work for asylum seekers and refugees in South Africa. And then a further, much more recent example is, again, during the recent lockdown in South Africa, the South African government announced a special social grant that was going to be available to all those in very desperate need. However, when they published the legal documents related to who would be able to get that special grant, they did not include asylum seekers, and they did not include people who are here on specific types of migrant visas. At the same time, what we saw is that those two groups of people were indeed in very, very desperate and dire circumstances. And so initially, we tried to provide some welfare services, as did many organizations across South Africa. And then we resorted to letter writing, and we wrote to the persons in position of power who are decision makers. And that also did not work. And eventually we used legal advocacy and South Africa's constitution in order to take the matter to court and challenge the exclusion of these specific groups of people. And we were successful there, which has meant that many more people who are asylum seekers and who are on these special migrant visas have been able to access this grant during South Africa's lockdown. So that's an example of legal advocacy. I wonder if any of the participants have other examples from your own contexts of legal advocacy that has been successful? Okay, I'm going to move on then. So the next level or type of advocacy that we have is, or that we've identified, is what we've termed high-level advocacy. And for me, this refers to when you are in Parliament advocating directly to the members of Parliament, or when you make decision makers aware of an issue and those decision makers are at the highest level of government. And so that's what we refer to as high-level advocacy. It can also include making public comments, formal public comments and written submissions on certain pieces of legislation or draft legislation. And it can include making written comments and submissions to international human rights mechanisms. For example, the African Commission, to special rapporteurs, and also to the Human Rights Council and United Nations bodies. And so that's high-level advocacy. Tim, yes, go ahead.
No, just to say, that was the level of advocacy which Mike covered in his talk on Tuesday, and yes, covered it very well. I wonder if other people who are listening have had experience of doing that kind of level of advocacy.
I don't see any hands raised. So I'm going to link into another thing that that I know Mike is involved in, and I'm sure that others who are participating have also had experience in. And that's communications advocacy. These terms are not formal terms, but throughout any intervention, there is always an important role that can be played through the use of communications, and particularly the use of the media. And so whether it's a radio program, or whether it's writing news articles, or tipping off journalists and giving them information, communications advocacy is something that's really useful to highlight a need and to try and push and motivate for an appropriate intervention. So would anyone like to provide any more information on any of the types of advocacy that we've identified and that you can see on the screen there, or ones that we perhaps have missed? I see that Eusebius has unmuted himself.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
In Kenya, we operate on high-level advocacy. The Kenya
Yes.
Conference of Catholic Bishops, we've realized that the law, the Refugee Act, encourages confinement of refugees in camps, which then interferes with the ability to get them to get employment in other parts of the countries. So if that one is not changed, then the needs of some of the refugees will be will not be catered for well. So we've been advocating for the change of law so that the refugees can be integrated in various parts of the country so that they can then get to work, they go to schools wherever they want. So I just wanted to give that contribution on high-level advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's a really excellent example, particularly, I mean, I know that Kenya has a wonderful constitution. And so the weaving in of the rights that are provided for in Kenya's constitution and using those in high-level advocacy is also an incredibly powerful tool. Do we have any examples from or experience from the rest of the continent that participants would like to share? So perhaps then I can move on and ask or put a challenge out to just find out if anyone can give us an example of challenges that the individuals who are impacted might face when they are trying to engage in advocacy. So Eusebius has just spoken about the Kenyan context and the fact that there is an encampment-based system there. So maybe that's a good place to start. What types of challenges might that pose to a migrant, a refugee, or an asylum seeker who's trying to engage in advocacy, him or herself? Any takers? I'm trying to make this as interactive as possible.
Or maybe people would like to say how difficult it is for migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers to engage. And just tell us about that.
So perhaps one of the examples that I can give is language. And the fact that sometimes there are language barriers that make it difficult for someone to deeply engage in advocacy. What other difficulties can participants here think of that they've seen in their experience? Okay, I'm going to give a clue, which is just simply the knowledge of various advocacy routes and knowledge of, for example, how the country context may differ. So let's say you are from Somalia and you come to South Africa. These are very different contexts, and the way that an advocacy initiative might work would be very different in each of those countries. I think that the same must apply when one considers Cameroon or Nigeria, and that extends to knowledge of the refugee system in a country or knowledge of the asylum system in a country. So that's one of the challenges that we've identified. A further one, which I have mentioned, and I'm trying to remember to speak slowly because perhaps this is a good reminder for me, is the language or language as a barrier for asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants who want to engage in advocacy. What about this one? Is there anyone who's able to speak more about potential fear of being targeted in a specific context? it is a topic that we're going to cover in a later slide as well, which is just that xenophobia is a concern, and perhaps if one is a migrant or an asylum seeker or a refugee, that if you stand out, or if you are known for speaking out, or indeed if you're known for trying to assist others in one of these groups, that there may be some negative consequences that you might be afraid of. And then we have this one, which is if you are from a place, then it's likely that you have personal networks and connections in that place that may help you to be able to advocate for a need or for a person. And when you are not from that place, it's far more difficult because you do not have those connections. And so social capital and personal connections certainly help when one is trying to engage in advocacy. And one of the very powerful networks that provides a foundation for advocacy is the network of churches across our continent. And another one is the network of Catholic parliamentary liaison officers. So these are ways that we can create networks that will help to facilitate advocacy and will help to amplify a message. And then another one that we have is just to ask the question of who is viewed as an expert. And so sometimes where there are language barriers, where there is fear of being targeted, and perhaps where there is less knowledge of the system and less social capital, a person who is directly impacted may not necessarily be viewed as an expert in their own situation. And so we need to be conscious of that and try to ensure that wherever possible, when we are doing advocacy work, we are constantly checking in with the people who we are advocating for, and ensuring accountability for ourselves and for the messages and advocacy that we are doing. I'm going to hand over to Tim now, I think. Yes.
Okay, thank you for that, Sally. A little look at how advocacy needs and demands are she received.
Sorry, Tim, I got confused. I'm still on this one.
I think it's yours, actually.
Yes, it is mine. Sorry about that, everyone. I was skipping through my notes and I skipped too far. So this is simply just who is receiving a demand or a message that's an advocacy message. And here, would anyone like to volunteer some examples again? I know that we have already covered them in our discussion. So maybe if we could just have 3 volunteers with an example of who one targets with an advocacy message, need, or demand. Maybe I can volunteer Mark, because I think you did have one. Nope. Any volunteers for who the target audience might be? Okay. So then we've got Sorry, there we go. I've given 3 examples. These examples are not exhaustive, but they do assist us with thinking about who we would target. And so on a level of officials, we had a useful example that was provided earlier about birth registration. And so there, an official would be your ground level official. So someone who may be in charge of providing documentation, or maybe in a camp setting, it's someone who's in charge of providing shelter or other service provision to those in a camp. And so those are some of the people who would be your target audience for advocacy and an advocacy message. Then we have legislators, and I think we've given a lot of examples of how legislators may be targeted, but or maybe the person's receiving a message. Specifically, the example that was provided by Eusebius from Kenya, where it's advocating for the rights of individuals and trying to advocate for greater integration into society. And then a further recipient group of an advocacy message is the general public. And this is about integration as well, and ensuring that we try and create a space where there is less fear of difference and fear of persons coming into our society, and more care being offered and concern for their needs. And the example provided, I think it was Berhanu from Ethiopia, is a good example there, where all 3, general public, legislators perhaps, but officials as well, were the target audience for advocacy needs and demands. Now I'm going to hand over to Tim.
But maybe, Sally, while we're on that one, we could ask the question and anybody could answer.
Yes.
How has your advocacy been received? Maybe you could give us an example. We had one example from Kenya, but when you've done advocacy in the past, how has it been received? Anybody like to tell us about that?
Okay.
Philip.
Oh, thank you very much. When I was working amongst the refugees at one time, the advocacy I had was amongst the local farmers and the local churches. So when I asked for food for the refugees, people responded. But when I went to the legislators, it was a different thing altogether. I was told, Reverend, wait until I was transferred. But with the locals, it was very easy. I could get what I wanted to assist the refugees. That is the general public. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. That's a very good example. So you had a good reception in the community, but when you went to a higher level, to the legislature, not so good. Anybody else have an example of that?
I see that Mark's got his hand up.
Mark?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, my observation on this input will be that you will hardly have a uniform feedback in terms of how this engagement will be received. And largely, how it will be received is determined by perception. It is also to a large extent determined by interest. The public, legislators, and maybe government officials in every given situation will always be looking for a situation to have an advantage. And again, to a large extent, you would discover that there would also, how it is received is determined by who the refugees are or who the migrants are. Sometimes the religious factor plays in. In most cases, people are also able to be more sympathetic based on who are the people involved. And from philanthropists and generous givers, it is always easy, especially if the engagement or request is coming from the platform of the church, knowing that there will be some level of prudence and sincerity in the management and in the handling of whatever is received. But from government officials and legislators or politicians, you will see that the situation will be different, because they will always want to use such situation and scenario to be able to drive their political interest. And when bureaucracy has to play in before approvals are given and before relief are received, some for these interventions are no longer there, or the need is no longer even being met, and when the need is no longer as desirous as it was meant to be. And so you see, it's a contextual situation where you do not have a very clear divergent method of receiving and how the reaction plays in. So it all depends on the situation at hand, and then the actors that are at play and who receives or who is meant to give.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
To you, Mark?
Sure.
Which is, you've said that context is important. And so perhaps a question to you, but to anyone else as well, is how should we structure our advocacy needs, requests, or demands depending on who is receiving them and depending on the contexts? What techniques can we use to structure things based on the target audience?
Well, you actually have identified in your presentation different strategies. You know, you talked of letter writing, pastoral care, grassroots accompaniment, legal advocacy, high level, name them. Now, you would also discover that context will also still be very, very important here. How you structure it and how you engage will, to a large extent, be determined by a lot of factors. The environment, the law of the land, you know, and then those involved. That is why we cannot, in this specific, you can just give us an insight that it will be structured depending on the context we find ourselves, which will involve the law of the land, which will involve, you know, those refugees or migrants involved, because our continent or our countries or our environment varies. And so it makes it difficult to adopt a very specific approach on advocacy in this context. Hence, we do not all belong to one particular unique entity.
Absolutely. And perhaps a further context specific thing that will impact on advocacy is timing. And by timing, I mean not only kind of the timing of a request, but also the timing in respect of broader issues at play. So for example, is it wise to make advocacy requests when elections are around the corner, or when there is a different type of natural disaster in parts of the country? I think that sometimes we have to think about the timing of our requests, but we also have to weigh that up with the urgency of the situation and the urgency of the need. Sorry, Tim, I jumped in when I was handing over to you. Can I hand over to you now?
No, that's fine. That was very interesting. And I like the point that Mark made about, you know, how complex it is to advocate because of all the different factors that are at play, especially with politicians who have their own agendas. And
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt him. We've lost our French interpreter. She was disconnected for a second, so we just have to.
Wait.
She's back with us. We just need to designate her again, Megan, as the interpreter.
Sure.
Take us half a minute.
Lamont, did you get my request?
Sorry?
Did she get my request?
Yeah.
I'm not seeing it, the appointment next to her name.
No. Sorry, everyone. Just going to take. Here we are.
Sorry. My apologies. The connection wasn't good for a few minutes.
Okay. So we have designated you again as interpreter.
Thank you. All right. So I'll thank you.
You just have to accept the designation.
Sure. Earlier I didn't accept the designation, so it should have worked now.
Yeah.
Can Megan go into the? Megan, are you in the French? Hello?
Philemon?
I think, Philemon, you may need to just switch yourself onto the French channel.
Oh, right. Sorry, I thought that's what I have done. My apologies.
Okay.
Yes, I am in the French.
But we're hearing you in English.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I'm not sure why. My apologies. All right. So sorry, it's indicated as in the French side. Oh, I'm not sure. Okay.
I think we may have
sorry.
to.
No. My apologies. Yes. Because it's a language interpretation where I was it's the original audio, which is in English.
Yes.
So I have not then received the invitation.
You haven't.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Megan will try again to designate you as the interpreter.
There we go. I've designated you again, Philemon. Have you received the request?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not sure why. Right. should I call Micheline? I'm so sorry. We can put that in the chat. We can put I can make an outside call to you, Megan, and I can ask Micheline to come in because très bien, merci. All right. Yes, I'm not an interpreter because I'm not sure why I'm not able to connect again. I'm going to disconnect and then come back in.
Okay, so Megan, if you will designate Micheline as the interpreter, then.
Yes, sure.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, that's fine. And then Philomene is off. Oh, okay. So we'll carry on with Micheline as the interpreter then. Thanks. Sorry, Tim and Sally. Sorry for the interruption, but I think we're good to go.
Okay. So thank you for the discussion on that. That was very interesting. Anybody else have any experience of how their advocacy has been received or not received? No? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next subject then. If we can have the next slide, Sally, thank you. So we just thought we should deal very briefly with this subject. It's a subject that's been very important to us here in South Africa, but it may not be that important to you. We heard on Tuesday, I think, from somebody, was it someone in Zimbabwe, that it's not a big issue there, and I know that's true. It's not being a big issue in Zimbabwe and in many other countries. What's your experience? Have you had issues with relationship between refugees and migrants and the local citizens in your country? Have you had problems where people have resisted them coming in or have been hostile to them? Perhaps someone could give us an example of what their experience has been, and then we'll talk a little bit about that.
Perhaps we could call on some of the people who have been vocal, because I think Berhanu, if you're still here, although I don't see Berhanu's name anymore, I thought that example in Ethiopia was an interesting one, but I think that we may have lost Berhanu, so maybe that one's not going to work.
Onomen?
Yeah, hello.
Onomen? Yeah.
Onomen, yes.
Yes, I was speaking from Nigeria. Basically, we have not really had hostility from host communities. What we've had rather is the host communities asking for or demanding for similar support in terms of livelihood support for our beneficiaries. So we've tried to also accommodate them and give a certain percentage of support to host communities so they don't disrupt some of our activities in the camps. So that has been the experience in the areas where we have worked with IDPs.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. We heard recently that there was trouble in Uganda between the host community and refugees. Uganda is known as a country that has willingly accepted refugees for many years, and it seems that the relations have been good, but there have been problems. Jairus, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to contribute to that very crucial topic. I think in Kenya, specifically in Kakuma refugee camp, there is no all that big problem of discrimination, but there has always been minor challenges, especially between the host community and the refugees, and specifically on issues of livelihood concerns, where the host community feel like the refugees are more taken care of at the expense of the host community, whereby sometimes the host community experience drought, famine, and when there is all those problems, challenges, suffering due to lack of food or water, and they see the refugees enjoying all that, getting water, getting food rations every, maybe after a month. So they see that it is like the government is more taking care of the refugees at the expense of the host community. But I think an integrated plan was later on developed whereby the host community are also taken care of in terms of livelihood activities, in terms of capacity building, so that they can start their own businesses, because the issues of handouts does not last any longer. But when they are trained, their capacity built on areas like carpentry, then they are given some small capital in form of groups, not individuals, but groups, be it women groups, youth groups, so that they can start business and they can sustain themselves with all that they are doing. I think that has helped a bit, because initially there were heightened tensions on between the host community and the refugees because of those challenges of livelihood concerns. But of late, because of the integration, like if you look at Kalobeye resettlement camp, whereby the host community also play a role, they are also looked into as much as the UNHCR focuses on refugees, but they also take into consideration the immediate needs of the host community. I think it is working better now.
Thank you, Jairus. That's very important, the points you have raised, where the host community feels that they are not being favored or that they are being discriminated against. And we have had that experience in South Africa as well. And so one solution is to design programs which also incorporate the host community in them. Of course, it becomes more complex, especially with not a lot of funding. Does anybody else have experience of that kind of attitude from the host community and how it has been dealt with? Okay, let's move on then. We've looked at some examples of African countries where there is a problem. We've looked a little bit at our advocacy response. It's a complicated response because we are obviously advocating for the people who are most vulnerable, which is refugees and migrants, but we also need to make sure that we don't advocate for them at the expense of the host community. So it's a complicated situation, and our approach has to be very subtle. What should we keep in mind when doing advocacy in order to avoid confirming stereotypes and avoid stirring negative sentiment? What's the best approach when you are doing advocacy on behalf of people who are coming into your country and they lack many things, and there is a perception about them which may be false? What's the best approach to take in that situation?
So Tim, maybe I can volunteer, not the best approach, but something that I try to remain conscious of in the advocacy work that we do. And that is, there is often a tendency to describe a refugee or an asylum seeker in terms of their vulnerability. So for example, in various court judgments, the South African courts have said this is a very, or an extraordinarily vulnerable group. And when one is advocating for the removal of a specific barrier or advocating to try and secure a specific right, it's often easy to try and use that vulnerability to as a tool to try and get the advocacy need that you're trying to achieve. And the one of the things that I have experienced time and again in the direct work that we do with asylum seekers and refugees is exactly how resilient many of these individuals are. And so it feels something that I think is quite important is while we can acknowledge vulnerability, it's also important to acknowledge resilience. And so perhaps it's important to acknowledge that there isn't one group or one identity or one description that can be used, but that we have to acknowledge the complexity and the individuality of members of the group that we refer to as asylum seekers and refugees and migrants. And in that way, we are also able to try and show others that we work with in host communities that this group of persons is not homogeneous.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, Mark.
Yeah, just a concern, and I like to say that I am privileged, and I think many of us there too on this platform should be privileged to be talking with you, Smith, and Sally in this very all-important topic that concerns advocacy. Looking at xenophobia there and afrophobia, perhaps raising this concern could go a long way to clear some doubts and give some form of justification to the efforts we have been making as development actors and as humanitarian actors. Then looking at more specifically, Sally, who in your brief introduction, you've told us you are an advocate, you know, as it has to do with your profession. I'd like to ask, because this issue of xenophobia is of very serious concern to us in Nigeria, and I'm sure to an extension to you in South Africa and to and other countries in Africa. What would you discuss?
Mark, I don't know if everyone else is, but we're losing you at the moment.
Results, and they are recorded xenophobic attacks from sets in South Africa. Can you hear me now?
Mark,
can you hear me now?
We lost the first part of your question. Can you repeat it again?
Okay. I was just trying to check with you. I said, with this xenophobic challenge that we are having. We are most times in Nigeria, you hear this situation, South African has a lot of investment in Nigeria. Nigerian and South African share a lot of things in common. And so whenever there are these issues of xenophobia comes up, you will always hear people in Nigeria say, oh, let's go do this, let's go do that. But perhaps because of the fact that we share a lot in common, this is not often being perpetuated in terms of reprisals, in terms of attack and things like that. And so my simple question is, what would you say are results and successes that you in the forefront of advocacy have achieved or are achieving in respect to this xenophobic challenge?
Sure.
Good question.
Very
Sally?
good question. Tim, do you want to go first? I'm happy to jump in.
I'll just say that, you know, it's a huge problem and it's a complex problem. It has to do with a lot of things like our economy and the way it's been badly run. It has to do with our refugee law and the system, which is not functioning well. It has to do with the fact that we accepted so many people after 1994 in a situation which was very different to today. And there have been a lot of campaigns against xenophobia, but I'm not sure how successful they've been. But let me hand over to Sally, I think, who's been working more at the coalface, so to speak, with this in this area.
So I think there are different levels of response. The one type of response is if we go back to the beginning of this presentation, the immediate needs of people. And so that can include provision of counseling, but also accompaniment to try and help people who have been impacted by xenophobia to lay charges at their local police station, because sometimes it is a reality that if someone who's not South African goes to the police station to try and lay charges, they may experience barriers. So that's a kind of a very direct response. But at the same time, there is a much more long-term response that that we're trying to engage in, along with, again, I may be speaking from my experience at Scalabrini, but I do want to acknowledge that there are so many organizations in the sector here in South Africa who are trying, and often we collaborate, trying to change mindsets and combat this type of thing. We've noticed that there's often a resurgence of xenophobic sentiment around elections, and sometimes it's the result of comments made by persons in power. Maybe it's kind of cheap kind of electioneering, and so we collaborated with other organizations before our elections last year, and we trained journalists on how to report on xenophobia around elections, because we've thought that journalists would be an important an important voice, and they can often be the difference between xenophobia escalating or being de-escalated. And so we focused on journalists as an advocacy strategy, but at the same time we used letter writing and other higher level advocacy to try and speak to politicians directly and to engage with them to ensure that they were not stirring up xenophobic sentiments. And then the other type of advocacy that we've tried to use, and I think that the success is going to be something that is only measurable in the longer term, is to put accurate information out there. Often with xenophobia here in South Africa, a comment will be made and there is no evidence to back up that comment, but it will be accepted and it may stir up far more negative and xenophobic sentiment. And so what we've tried to do is highlight as much as possible what the accurate state of affairs is. So an example here is sometimes people will say that South Africa is being, and I'll quote, being overrun by foreigners. And then they use that to say that foreigners are taking our jobs, or foreigners are responsible for high crime levels. And so what we've tried to do is give accurate numbers of how many citizens and how many not South Africa born persons there are in South Africa, to show that that this fear that there is some sort of being overrun is not based in fact. We give accurate numbers of the number of asylum seekers in South Africa. A couple of years ago, there was an article that quoted that number as being in the millions, whereas on the 1st of January this year, Parliament asked our Department of Home Affairs, and the number of asylum seekers is just 188,000. There are probably some others who are not documented on Home Affairs' system, but it's not in the millions. So we use accurate information like that to try and provide the general public as well as politicians and journalists with information that will de-escalate a situation. And then a further technique that we've identified is to try and speak more about how the positives that non-citizens bring to South Africa. And so an example here is what's actually something that will be on all of South Africa's radio stations tomorrow, and it's linked to Heritage Day, but we were approached by a media partner to do this. They wanted to speak about the challenges that migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees have faced during the lockdown. And one of those challenges has been xenophobic sentiment. If you look at the picture that is on the slide at the moment, in South Africa, that would be called a spaza shop. And at the beginning of the lockdown, all spaza shops were named as essential services, which meant that they could continue to operate, even though other businesses had to shut down and people had to remain at their homes. And spaza shops are very important because they provide a local place where people can go and get food and basic necessities, so that you don't have to travel far. Many spaza shops are owned by, for example, Somalis in South Africa, as well as other non-citizen groups. And one of the comments made by a government official was that only South African-run spaza shops were deemed to be essential services. this was not based in law, and through an intervention, we made sure that that was not the case. But so in this radio broadcast that will be aired tomorrow, what we have made sure to focus on is everything that that migrants and asylum seekers and refugees bring to South Africa, but also the fact that by being in South Africa and by operating businesses here, by shopping here and buying goods here, they are contributing to the South African tax base. And that is very important for South Africa as a whole. So those are some, it's a much longer conversation, but those are some of the techniques and strategies and pieces of information that we've tried to highlight in our work. They're not foolproof, and yeah, xenophobia is an issue that we're constantly aware of, and that we're constantly thinking about in the way that we do our work and the way that we do our advocacy. I hope that that's given you something of an answer, Mark.
More than an answer, great feedback. And I am sure a lot of us out there have benefited from your response and feedback. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Smith.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll close up this discussion now. I think the whole question of xenophobia and afrophobia, of course, is bigger than us, because it's a huge issue in Europe and in other parts of the world at the moment. You may have seen on the news last night that the European countries have entered into a new agreement whereby they will agree to accept a certain number of refugees on the condition that they send a certain number of migrants home. It's a very complicated agreement, but that was made yesterday. So that all speaks to the xenophobia that exists in our world as a whole. But I think that's subject for another day. So I'm going to hand back to Sally to wrap up the discussion.
Sure. Maybe just one kind of further answer to that third point in this slide is just to keep in mind what I mentioned earlier, is that we're not speaking about a homogenous group, and that applies to asylum seekers and refugees and migrants, and it also applies to citizens. And so to always try and think of the individual and bring out individual voices and narratives and amplify them is very important. So just to finish up, we've got a note on creative advocacy. And so it's not formal advocacy. Sometimes it's better referred to as artistic activism. It's maybe not the type of advocacy that one is used to, and there's definitely a very specific time and place, and also a specific type of organization or actor who would engage in this type of advocacy. And so I want to just first speak about the pictures that you see in front of you, and then I'll go to the questions that I've posed on the side there. So Scalabrini Center has for a long time been engaged in litigation against the Department of Home Affairs because of a decision that department took to close down the building that you can see in the bottom left-hand picture. And so that building is where the Cape Town Refugee Reception Office was and is located. And the impact of the decision to close that office is that the closest refugee reception office to Cape Town is very, very far away. And you can see that based on the signposts that you can see in the bottom right-hand picture. And we were successful in that litigation. The Supreme Court of Appeal told Home Affairs that they must reopen the Cape Town Refugee Reception Office. And they were supposed to do that by the end of March in 2018. There's been some complications with the implementation of that court order. I'm not going to go into that now. But one of the things that an organization did here in Cape Town is they decided that they wanted to draw media attention to the fact that Home Affairs had not implemented this court decision. And so they had this campaign day where they went, because often outside of that Cape Town Refugee Reception Office, there are often long queues of people who are there to renew their documents. The reopening of it would mean that people can also apply for documents there, but at the moment, the office won't take new applications. It'll only renew. And so they created this advocacy campaign called the Department of Happiness Affairs instead of the Department of Home Affairs. And they did what you can see in the pictures there. So they had what looks more like a type of celebration rather than highlighting the very negative situation that was there. And they engaged with people who stand in the queues there. They had some cake there and things like that. And then they got media and journalists to come and take pictures. And it was a very different way of highlighting and drawing attention to an issue that has been going on for many years and that many journalists were perhaps familiar with, but didn't think was a new story. And so they weren't going to write about it anymore. And so this is one example of creative advocacy. It's not always the type of advocacy that that one should engage in for specific situations, but it was very useful in this situation to find a new way to draw attention to an old issue. And so to close, we just wanted to kind of bring attention to a different type of advocacy. It's a type that perhaps more grassroots organizations can engage in. And it's a useful way of thinking about the different strategies that can be used. And so these pictures and the advocacy that was done, it was all done by an organization called Sonke Gender Justice, and they're active throughout the region, and they'd come to us and spoken about doing this type of advocacy. Yeah, so we thought we would end on a fun note there, and I do also want to draw everyone's attention to what Father Peter John has written in the comments based on the discussion that we had around xenophobia. And that's the website XenoWatch, which is a project that is run by the African Center for Migration and Society. And they track xenophobic incidents in South Africa, but they also are very good at responding often before the incident has happened. So if a message starts going around on WhatsApp or on Twitter, they will call the local police station involved. Sorry?
Yeah, my battery shit.
Onomen, I think your microphone is on. Ah, there. Yeah, so XenoWatch is a very good resource as well. But yes, so that's a note on creative advocacy. And so the last thing is just to say thank you to everyone who's attended and who's engaged, and thank you to Tim. It's been wonderful to collaborate and work with you, and just to invite questions if anyone has any questions or follow-up or comments.
Thank you, Sally.
Well, thank you to both of you, Tim and Sally, for such a comprehensive presentation, and thank you for making it interactive as well.
Please sign up for our newsletter at cplo.org.za.